great. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today on this webinar on on investing in resilience. We're really thrilled to have a really exciting panel with you today. My name is Nathaniel Matthews, and I'm the CEO of the Global Resilience Partnership. And we've got, in terms of the structure of the panel, I'll be passing first to Professor Johan Rockström to present our paper, and then we'll go into a short intervention from each of the panelists, and then we'll have a question period. So for the audience, please put, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. Also online is Albert Nordström, one of the authors of our paper that this webinar is based around, that Johan will present, that was published in Nature Sustainability, entitled Shaping a Resilient Future in Response to COVID-19. And Albert will be also chiming in to answer some of the questions, because we may not get through all of them with the panelists, as these hours usually go pretty quickly, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. We've also had a couple small changes today. So one is Ozong from the African Development Bank unfortunately felt ill, but fortuitously, we had the wonderful Ekoshwehi, who is the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum, jump in at very short notice, and we're very grateful for that. And so she's a fantastic speaker on these issues, and so we're grateful to have her participation as well. And Emma will be joining us in just a minute. She's coming from another meeting. And just before we kick off, I also want to just take a moment that one of the key authors of this paper was Professor Salim Hook. He's been a dear friend to myself and a mentor to many, including me. He was the chair of GRP's advisory council, and very, very sadly, he passed away on the weekend. I would like to dedicate the webinar to him, and we are certainly all feeling the loss across the climate community of Salim. He had huge impact in this space, and was a real guiding light and tireless advocate for, as what I like to think of as the people's champion on adaptation and resilience. So Salim is definitely in our thoughts, and I know many of you are close with him on the webinar as well. And so with that, I would like to pass over to Johan. Johan, you're Professor Johan Rockström is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, and professor in earth science at the University of Potsdam. Alongside this, he is chief scientist at Conservation International, and he also advises on sustainable development issues at various international meetings, such as the United Nations General Assemblies and the World Economic Forums. And he also served before as founding director of the Stockholm Resilience Center and director of the Stockholm Environment Institute. Johan, it's great to see you again, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'll pass over to you now to present the paper and your thoughts around it.
Yeah, thanks, Nate, and great to be with you. And I'll be sharing my screen here. I hope this works like that. And as Nate says, this is an opportunity to present to you a paper, but I'll do that in the broader context of the, let's say, the strategic directions of resilience for development, and just say that the origins of this paper is basically coming out of 30 years of resilience theory that shows that, never lay a crisis to waste. Crisis is the very mother of transformations, and the COVID-19 pandemic was clearly a global crisis point, and more than $10 trillion were brought forward by countries in recovery plans to rise after and to build more resilient trajectories post-COVID. And the term resilience was used across policy, business, across scales, from national to regional to the United Nations. And we thought it was the time to map, do they really understand what resilience is? How is it interpreted? And can we really see a true connection between the trillions of US dollars put behind a post-COVID recovery and a real resilience trajectory? So that's basically the context. But to set that into a real framing for a discussion like this one today, I think it's worth to start with the situation that we are in right now. We are deep into the Anthropocene, 70 years since launching the Great Acceleration in the mid-1950s. We are starting to hit the ceiling of biophysical, hardwired processes that regulate the stability of the entire Earth system. Even COVID-19 is a manifestation of the Anthropocene. The interconnectedness between humans and overexploitation of natural habitats is now in the work from the IPBS, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, shown to increase risks of exactly this kind of zoonotic viral disease outbreaks. So we are in a situation where we have a new hockey stick. The rise, which you see here, of viral disease outbreaks because of zoonotic transfers from wildlife, often via domestic animals, to humans, starting in the mid-1950s, right at the Great Acceleration point with Zika, and we all remember the HIV epidemic, but then also coming into SARS, MERS, Ebola, the whole swine flu and avian flu risks we're facing still today, and then finally COVID-19. And the evidence that it's not a question if we will face future pandemics, it's the question when, and that we have an up to 40% risk already in our lifetime to face the next pandemic. And of course, that resilience building is therefore absolutely fundamental. And that in the Anthropocene, in this point of interconnectedness, we are forced to conclude that we are in an unprecedented level of turbulence, and that this turbulence today is social ecological. It's deep into a climate crisis. We're deep into an ecological crisis, which is now manifesting itself in unprecedented ways, both in terms of direct impacts like droughts, floods, heat waves, disease patterns, but also such as the COVID pandemic, which then interacts with the geopolitical instability in the world. Everything from the Ukraine war, but now also the devastating intermezzo's we have between Israel and Hamas. This is the world of today that we have to recognize that academically we are increasingly forced to explore the risks of moving towards a polycrisis, when we have global systemic crises that occur simultaneously and reinforce each other. A main topic at the World Economic Forum last year, and a central topic today in academia. This is where resilience is embedded. And to put this really finally at the existential level, is that we now have scientific evidence that the resilience of the Earth system itself regulates the stability of the entire planet, and therefore the livability for humanity on Earth. And this is a whole seminar on its own, so I'll just put one slide to prove my point, which is the ice core data synthesis of the Osman et al. Paper, showing how we leave the last ice age 18,000 years ago. We transform in a major crisis-driven shift from hunters and gatherers to becoming farmers and sedentary communities when we enter this extraordinary stable Holocene state that we've had the last 12,000 years. And we can today conclude scientifically that it's the stability and the functioning of the biological living parts of the Earth system that determines to a large extent our ability to have stable social and economic development in the world. And this is where the resilience science really originates from, the ecological resilience theories around diversity, redundancy, and stable ecosystems as part of understanding also the stability of societies. So this is where we enter the assessment on response to COVID-19. And we did a kind of a thorough mapping of this. One additional point that I should mention, though, is that all of this is, of course, about risk. So the resilience theory is a framing to be able to handle uncertainty, to navigate turbulent conditions, to avoid irreversible and unmanageable outcomes. And we have the evidence there as well, just to kind of tick that off. And this is the latest evidence published by the David Armstrong McKay et al. Paper in 2022 on the 16 big tipping element systems that we have now mapped scientifically. The breakthrough in this work is the color scheme here. And you should just look at the dark red tipping element systems, the big biophysical systems that regulates the stability of the Earth system. The red ones are those that are likely to cross their tipping points at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So just showing how at risk we are on the Greenland ice sheet, boreal permafrost thawing, the West Antarctic ice sheet, loss of the Barents Sea ice, and losing all tropical coral reef systems, the livelihood base for over 300 million people, which is fundamentally the question of maintaining the planet in a resilient state. So here you have, so to say, the entry points to this assessment. So now coming to the paper, we started off by mapping off big institutions and their action plans on resilience, both kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID, and you have them here. The conclusion is that only 4 out of 16 larger international organizations have actually defined resilience in a scientifically based way, and thereby kind of acting on it more than just let's call it a bit bluntly just as a buzzword. We see a very clear tendency of, even when resilience is represented, that it's used and focused on only as a bouncing back strategy. So you have a problem, and then what are the investments required to bounce back to your original state? This is one element of resilience, but it's certainly not where we understand resilience today from the Global Resilience Partnership or the science, and I'll come to the definitions here. We've been mapping it country-wise as well, and what you see here is in green-blue, the countries that have evidence of incorporating resilience response post-COVID, but also integration of climate resilience in risk management. So large parts of the world here remains without any focus on resilience, despite the need more than ever on resilient strategies. And with this work, we've also suggested a kind of an update on how we define resilience, which I think can be quite useful, not least in the GRP setting, which overarching is today quite well understood as being the capacity to live and develop with change, meaning how to navigate turbulent conditions with one fundamental dimension, the adaptive capacity to absorb shocks and turbulence and to avoid regime shifts, so moving from one state to another. So basically what we call persistency, the ability to remain in a stable state. And I would argue that this is now what we have to address from the community level, but all the way up to the planetary scale. The second dimension of resilience, as we understand it today, is the capacity to learn and navigate in situations of uncertainty, what you could call adaptive capacity. All the investments in agency and knowledge, in community building, to share information to be able to navigate turbulent conditions. But then the third capacity, which is increasingly part of resilience theory, is the ability to rise in situations of crisis, in transformations, and create new pathways for innovation and options for life. So not only adaptation to coping with stress, but also to rise in situations of change, and really manifested in the capacity for transformation. And that this is probably the fourth dimension here, potentially the most central one in situations of really deep systemic crisis, polycrisis type risks. So there we are. The evidence shows that there are 5 attributes of investment areas to build resilience across these 4 areas. Just going through them very quickly. if there is a red thread in resilience theory over the past 30 years, is that social and ecological diversity builds resilience. I think we can say that as an unequivocal piece of evidence today. And that's really exciting. I mean, it's basically that social systems have a lot to learn from ecological systems, that functional diversity and response diversity helps in dealing with shocks and stress as we evolve. Redundancy, which is a really challenging insight, that you don't want to optimize all the way down to the absolute edge of risk. You want to have a bit of extra fat in the system, or some extra flexibility and ability to therefore be flexible. You don't want to put all your money on one horse. You want to spread it, but you also want to have a little bit of redundancy. And this goes from ecology all the way into social and financial and institutional systems. Connectivity, fundamental in the globalized world we live in today. How global trade, food system security, energy, infrastructure, essentially the entire intertwined socio-ecological system is today a connected system, which can lead to more resilience, but can also cause brittle impacts, like, for example, a flood in Thailand that knocked over all the semiconductor production, or large parts of it, in the market. So this is a very kind of a double-edged sword in resilience building. Finally, an inclusivity and equality, a fundamental part of resilience building, to have the evidence that more equitable societies are also more resilient and stable societies. Trust being one of those fundamental attributes that we discuss a lot today in this world of fake news and populism and an increasing extremism. And finally, adaptive learning, the whole point that if you really want to have a capacity to navigate changing conditions, you want to have the ability to learn and to rise in the face of new knowledge. And of course, with the AI and the digital pathways, this is also fundamental, not least from an equity perspective. So there we are, and I'll leave you with this slide just to place all of this work on the resilience recovery post-COVID, where our conclusion is that resilience is out there. There's a lot of talk about resilience, very little understanding of what resilience really means, and that we need to continue working as GRP to kind of spread the word of adaptive capacity, persistency, and transformability, and that we are at this point of big transitions in the world, where, for example, here, just reflected in terms of accelerating the pathway back to a safe operating space within planetary boundaries, that we have a lot of positive developments in terms of mass movements and some political progress, significant at times, everything from the IRA in the US to the Fit for 55 in the European Union. But we are at the same time facing counter forces that are very significant: the geopolitical instability, inertia and status quo, and the tendency, as you've seen just recently, of $7 trillion in subsidies for fossil fuel infrastructure, as showing how we are kind of weighing back and forth in this transition point, which is also part of resilience theory, to understand that these are the changing forces that means that the floor we're standing on is never entirely stable. We have to be able to navigate very, very, kind of gauntlet conditions as we move forward. So there we are, a bit of a challenge for the discussion here, I hope. And back to you, Nate.
Thank you very much, Johan. That's fantastic framing to start us off. And I think it really speaks, that last slide, talking about this is the fastest economic transition that we'll have experienced, is really speaking to that need for investment in resilience. And it's also critical that if we're going to have this economic transition, it has to be led by investments from a number of sectors. And something that GRP is working on very closely is our prepare call to action to the private sector, is bringing private sector actors together to meaningfully invest in resilience. And we've got, we're building up to quite a few companies. We have other major companies like Microsoft, Google, Meta, and others on board for that now, and we'll be relaunching that at COP28. And we've got some great people to talk about that with us today. So I'd like to begin by introducing the panelists. So we've got Alexander or Alex Bassian, the Director of Innovative Finance at the Rockefeller Foundation with us. We're very pleased to have you here, Alex, and thanks for waking up early. I know it's early on the East Coast. And Echo Shui is the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum as well, which is fantastic. And I know Emma is joining us in a minute. She's just coming from another meeting and got a bit held up, but she'll be, I think, chiming in 1 minute or so. And Emma's the chair of the London Climate Resilience Review and the former chair of the Environment Agency. So with that, I'd like to start to begin with some questions. And Alex, I might turn to you first. And just given your role with the Rockefeller Foundation and your background that spans investments, corporates, and now philanthropy, could you tell us a bit about how those three perspectives on resilience differ from one another, and what you're seeing shifts within philanthropy in terms of investing in adaptation resilience, given that to date, really the climate change, I would say, has been quite divided between mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And we're starting to see an awakening to the need to invest in resilience. But as Johan has articulated, it still has a long way to go, given the needs on the ground and the challenges we're facing.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Nice to be here. So at the Rockefeller Foundation, we recently have made several pledges around climate and have been investing in adaptation and resilience related areas for a long time. We may not have termed it always as such with the terminology, but in things relating to food systems and agriculture in particular, for instance, our food for medicine and true cost accounting of food, as well as recently several commitments around renewable energy, clean energy, and climate finance investments. Admittedly, on the climate finance specific piece, I think we and many others in the philanthropic space do focus, as well as corporates, on the mitigation side, and there's increased interest and focus on understanding what the implications are for supporting resilience and adaptation investments at the intersection of mitigation and then independent, sort of on a standalone process, from a standalone basis, where we can support resilience and adaptation and investments. Just to give a few examples from the philanthropic side, we're looking very carefully at the Amazon rainforest and ways to protect biodiversity and ecosystems. In this area, we look very closely at regenerative agriculture and soil health and the connection there with smallholder farmers and food systems, and what the interplay there is between agricultural technology investing, for instance, in precision agriculture or sustainable agriculture, regen ag technologies, and how those can support adaptation and resilience in smallholder agriculture landscapes, as well as large corporate landscapes. For instance, on the corporate side, Unilever has recently pledged a very large $1 billion commitment around natural capital and resilience there to explore how the food system and agriculture and land systems are being eroded and how they can support it. There are many other corporates that we've seen now, PepsiCo, Nabisco, and the like, looking at those areas to improve adaptation and resilience of those systems, and the people who work those systems. And we collaborate with corporates as well on that side, in addition to our direct investments in the area on ways to help with the transformation there. So I'll pause for now.
Thanks, Alex. That's great. And it's a good reminder that the way we approach resilience, and we see as fundamental to approaching resilience, is that it's through a healthy biosphere, a healthy environment is the foundation of a healthy society and healthy economy. And that really highlights that. And I think when we're looking at building resilience, it has to be in tandem with the work we're doing to keep the environment as healthy as well. So thanks for that. Ekoshui, if I could turn to you now. And so, it'd be great to hear some of your reflections from the role of the insurance industry in advocating for greater resilience. And the IDF has really been a shining light in this regard. And I know that resilience has come up as part of as an observer in the operating development committee. Myself, I've seen this, discussed extensively. And it may be also just reflecting a bit in historically, the industry has been pretty reactive, compensating for losses after they occur, and really trying to think about how the IDF is facilitating that paradigm shift towards proactivity and preventative measures, and actually building resilience to a lot of the climate-related disasters that we're seeing coming through. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nate, for the invitation. It's really great to be here and to see so many familiar faces. So hi, Emma. And I really enjoyed the presentation from Johan, because it spoke to, risk, uncertainty, and turbulence, things that insurers have to deal with on a daily basis, if one can say so, right? But it's also very challenging given the reality when we consider climate change and also the experiences of COVID-19. So in terms of the perspectives from the Insurance Development Forum, our position has always been, revisiting the concept of insurance, which at its core is really about how do you provide better protection for people and drive greater safety, security to support development. And this alludes to a number of things that I think Johan referred to in terms of what does adaptation and resilience really mean in terms of dealing with shocks, the ability to respond, but beyond that, to craft what does a transition and a viable future look like, right? So from our perspective, the challenge that we now face within the IDF and within the insurance community is how do we support that process? And there are a number of ways. I think, perhaps we have not done a great job, but the insurance sector is a crucial part of the financial ecosystem. In terms of helping the system to better manage risk. And I will focus on 3 ways that we feel that there's a significant role that we can play in terms of the climate agenda when we focus on resilience and adaptation. The first is putting a price on risk, which can send signals in terms of what is not going right and the need to take better actions. It's a contribution that is perhaps not as valued, but we are increasingly seeing that emerging not only in developing countries, but in developed countries where particular areas are becoming increasingly uninhabitable. And so there is a signal that is sent or can be sent by the industry in terms of those locations, but the need for better public policy to deal with those risks. And that's an important contribution. But that also, I think, presents an opportunity, and many again do not see some of the historical roles that the industry has played, for example, in helping the electrification of modern society, right? It was the industry that made it a viable proposition through the creation of Underwriters Laboratory, which basically is a mechanism that secures or gives a signal in terms of the safety of electrical equipment. And I sort of use this analogy as, the way in which we, within the insurance sector, are increasingly trying to think through what are the levers in terms of how we send signals as relates to risk that we can use to push better practice. So that's one element. The second element is really core towards the function of the industry, which is providing protection. Right now, the global annual premium volume of the industry stands about $7 trillion. And of that, it contributes $5 trillion per annum to global financial resilience in the form of payments of claims and benefits. And this is significant because it is also the largest contribution to individual business and community resilience than any source outside of direct government contribution. So that's an important fact that we need to understand. And that's inherent to what the industry's purpose is in terms of providing protection so people can take risks and develop and do the things and make the investments that they need to make. The third area is that the third component, I would say, that is important is that the industry also sits on significant assets or manages significant assets over $40 trillion. And so it matters, or that is an opportunity in terms of influencing how that funding can be used to support and drive resilience. And these are big things, I think, that we should all be engaged in thinking, how can the industry support greater resilience, but how can the industry use its own capability to drive that in terms of its investments? But the reality, Nate, is that many developing countries do not have robust insurance markets. We are talking about 1 to 3% in terms of insurance penetration rates compared to most developed markets, which stands at 30%, 40% and more. So when we talk about resilience, we are also talking, especially in vulnerable communities, an absence of protection mechanisms to actually allow people to adapt, cope with shocks, far less imagined possibilities, right? And so I flag this in terms of when we think about insurance, let us think about it in terms of the architecture that it represents and the capability that it represents, and what are the opportunities that can allow us to transition into what a resilient future needs to look like. And so that's really central to the work of the IDF and a lot of our objectives, and I can go into those details as we progress.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I mean, those numbers are just enormous when you're talking about them, when you start to get into the trillions of dollars. But as you say, also that real opportunity within developing countries and emerging markets, developing economies, to really build out resilience and the role of the insurance industry. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Emma, I'd like to turn to you now. Thanks for joining us. I know you've had a hectic morning, but we appreciate you coming on. And really like to think, I guess, sort of a combined question. So one of the key components of resilience that we see is inclusivity and equity, and of course, gender is a key component of that. So, especially with a bit of a lens on cities, particularly those vulnerable to climate change, how do you see the ability to attract investment for resilient measures in these cities, and how can we address that component of gender as well, and inclusivity and equity within that?
Well, thank you, Nate, and great to join you all today, albeit a little bit late. I was out on a site visit this morning, which I think brings some of what you've been discussing absolutely to the fore. And I think where we are looking at finance, we also have to understand how it flows through to the real economy and to real people who are at the front line of what our changing climate is bringing. So I was looking at some of the transport systems in London today, and understanding the opportunities of investing when we are looking at new transport systems, but also the importance of understanding how much, particularly in a country like the UK, is historic, and we need to get ready for upgrades relevant to the weather that we're now beginning to experience. We also have a storm coming our way. We have experienced heat waves at a smaller scale to other parts of the world, but taking it through to people and gender and that gender lens as well. We've got to remember the people who are at the heart of driving those services that make our infrastructure systems work. And often I feel in the work we do in finance, we forget that flowing through to the real economy and real people, and the real people at all levels supporting cities in the way that they function. I, like a couple of others of you on the panel, are involved in some of the gender-focused work that Kathy Bothman-McLeod is leading through Climate Resilience for All, and taking some fantastic work in partnership with the insurance sector to make sure that money flows through to women in particular in parts of the world where they are unable to touch tools because they are too hot. They are working in temperatures because they need to earn their $2 a day to keep their families functioning. And is there a way through working with the insurance sector and philanthropy to get money through to help these people survive some of the extraordinary climate events that are being experienced. And those of us living in other parts of the world have a lot to learn from the way that we are working with the poor, with the vulnerable, to get ready for the changes that we know are locked in the decades to come. And I am convinced that money, financing has a massive role to play. But we really now need to roll up our sleeves and get into the detail of the different types of financial products and structures that will help different interventions take place, whether it's new infrastructure, new housing, or in parts of the world like London, the UK, where you've got a huge amount of retrofitting that needs to happen. We know that our investments that we're currently making towards net zero are massively at risk if we do not take into account the changing climate that, as all of the scientists that we listen to are saying, are happening at a greater speed than perhaps we'd anticipated or hoped that we would be delaying by now. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Great points. And yeah, I think that key point is that, you know, all these investments and the efforts towards net zero need to be coupled and dovetail with the efforts in resilience, or they will be for naught. And I think that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Johan, I'd like to jump over to you now. And I know you do a lot of work advising corporates. And so I would love to hear some, perhaps anonymized anecdotes from your experience working with corporates on how market-based incentives, penalties, and regulations can be structured to make resilience a more integral part of corporate planning, and where also you see those barriers. What are corporates saying who aren't investing in resilience, and how are they sort of shifting or not?
Yeah, that's a big question, Nate, and I think in a way it connects back to the inputs so far in the panel, and not least Emma's point here at the end, that we have more and more evidence that big financial investments, also in the corporate sector, are at risk of being lost if you do not integrate resilience thinking right from the very start or the planning phase. And my experience from some sectors that are really at the front line of the transition, like the car industry and the heavy truck industry, but also textile industry and let's say big retail industry that depend very, very closely on supply of wood and a supply of different natural materials. They start seeing the writing on the wall, moving. They've taken one big step over the last 15 years, which is moving on to the carbon path, doing actually quite good generally on the carbon trajectory, and recognizing the need to take an integrated approach, and recognizing even equity and questions around justice, looking across scope 1, scope 2, and 3, so both supply chains and consumers. But I also see just over the last 1-2 years, I mean, actually even post-COVID almost, a trend line towards taking on board particularly biodiversity, fresh water, and land. That there is this recognition of exactly the point that you made earlier, Nate, that a stable biosphere is also directly connected to the stability of societies and economies, and therefore affecting markets, consumer behaviors, and the stability and let's say competitiveness of companies. We're not there yet. I mean, as you know, we have the Science-Based Target Initiative on Climate, which is now being complemented by the Science-Based Target Network, trying to quantify targets, scientific boundaries for the other dimensions of the biosphere, but it's not in any way regulated. So that's also something. If we're talking about turbulence, I would add another dimension of turbulence, which is all the voluntary carbon markets and all the nature-based solutions and nature climate solutions, and the whole area on financial disclosure, which is very positively moving from carbon to also having nature as a financial disclosure dimension. But when I talk to CEOs, the first thing they tell me is that, you know, they're drowning under all the requirements to report on ESG dimensions, because there's such a, almost like a Klondike situation out there with so many, let's say, non-formal and formal regulatory measures out there. I think one should recognize that this is also part of resilience theory, that empirics show that once you're in a situation of transition, you tend to get higher degree of variability. You get more messiness in the system, and perhaps that's exactly what we're experiencing right now. We're actually in a major transition from a fossil fuel driven world towards a more sustainable economy, and that is a phase of turbulence, and that may be also what we're seeing in the corporate sectors. I see some light, but that's certainly not settled yet. And then just finally to say that I still lack this understanding, a broader systems perspective on resilience. What's the position of a company in a society, in a regional geopolitical sense? I think that is still very early stages. And then, as I mentioned in the talk, I mean, I think what we saw on international organizations in the paper we published, that resilience still tends to be understood as a bouncing back question, not the capacity to transform, is also still prevalent in the corporate sector, even though more parameters are being brought in. So there's still much to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I like that comment, especially about the messiness that we're experiencing now. And if we are to keep the planet within a space where humanity can continue to thrive, then that messiness is going to have to accelerate, really, to get through that transition as quickly as possible. So I think that presents a challenge for all of us moving forward. Ekoshwe, I'd like to, challenge, but also opportunity. And I think that's hopefully that the private sector will recognize that, and also recognize more the need to build resilience, and also to recognize the system connections. Actually, I know you have to leave us a few minutes early. So I'd like to jump over to you next. And I'm going to combine two questions here, just to give you a bit of latitude to speak across them. But first one is around the role of public-private partnerships, and these are often touted as key solutions for resilience. In terms of being able to provide everything from investments, from first loss guarantees, through to just helping the private sector to develop that business case and to accelerate investment in resilience. But sometimes they fail to deliver the intended benefits, especially for marginalized communities. I'd love to hear a little bit about what the IDF is doing to ensure that these partnerships genuinely serve all stakeholders, including the most vulnerable, and also combined with that, a little bit of a discussion around the role of data and risk assessment in insurance, and how making these solutions are also accessible and are benefiting those on the ground.
Okay, thanks. And it's very difficult questions individually, so to combine them is quite a challenge. I think, again, Johan touched on something which I think also defines PPPs, which is they are messy, they are complex, and they are difficult, but they are essential, given what we are seeing globally in terms of climate resilience and the urgency that we should be having in terms of tackling these issues. But when I think about PPPs and the work of the IDF, a lot of it is also about aligning incentives. It's about cultivating trust, making sure we are speaking the same language and understanding each other. And it's also about testing, implementing, and doing and learning, right? And so for us within the IDF, a lot of the work that we are focused on is bringing these communities that are non-traditional partners together to work in context in many times where they are absent, right? So I say this as a background for the kind of learning that all the parties from the insurance industry to the public sector members that are part of the IDF. When I say public sector, I'm not only talking about international organizations, but governments and civil society actors that need to be engaged in this process. So switching a little bit to the second question, which is how do we then broach this, is from our perspective, there's an important contribution that risk analytics can play towards this dialogue and supporting this conversation and the kinds of investments and implementation and activities that we need to be undertaking. But when, again, we look at the context that the IDF is focusing on in terms of emerging developing countries, there's really a challenge in terms of, people talk about, okay, making information available, but how is that information available in a way that people can make difficult choices? And in many countries that we are engaged in, there are difficult choices that need to be made. Part of it is technical, but part of it is also political and cultural. And better information can help. It's not the solution, but it can help. So within the IDF, we do have a program that's focused specifically on this challenge of making risk information available to those who need it the most. And part of that is a structural issue in terms of the work that we need to do around open risk modeling and interoperability standards. For example, how do we make sure that databases that, for example, the World Bank has can reconcile in terms of the way in which the industry treats information and making that available to governments? It's also about co-development of risk profiles and risk understanding with affected communities. And that's a central part of an effort that we launched with the V20 group called the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, where we work with countries directly to co-develop information that speaks to the concerns that they have and can inform those difficult choices that they need to make. And I think that this is a very tangible contribution in terms of the way in which the industry is trying to learn through working with our partners. We can then extend that a bit further to look at some of the work that we have been doing with the humanitarian community. For example, START Network, which is an organization of civil society actors all over the world, to design, again, or a program where we can provide these actors who are present in many of these countries, sometimes in areas where governments are not able to get to, information on these hazards so that they can undertake better and faster action. And also making sure that that is linked to financing, because it's not just about information, it's about how can you actually act with the information that you have. So I just shared this as some quick highlights, Nate, in terms of the complexity and the messiness of PPPs and the learning that we all need to do collectively in this space.
Thank you so much. That's great. And sorry to throw you two difficult questions at once, but I appreciate appreciate your great answers. We're just trying to squeeze some more wisdom out of you before you have to jump off. So that's fantastic. And yeah, we're really excited to be a close partner of IDF and your great work. So we'll look forward to keeping in touch on that. Alex, I might jump over to you next, just to think a bit more about the role of philanthropy in this space. And we've had I've had conversations with various philanthropic donors over the years, and some of them have reported back that resilience isn't an area that we work in because it's not something that we can solve. But I really feel that, especially in the last couple of years, that the tide is shifting. We saw in New York Climate Week some big gatherings on resilience and adaptation with philanthropies and more investment. And you mentioned some great examples in the food space, and I think that's a particular area that we're seeing more support in. But it would be great to hear a little bit more about the role that you see, both from the Rockefeller Foundation, but also within the network of philanthropies that Rockefeller helps convene and works with to facilitate more private sector investment into resilience. Is this more about supporting the ecosystem of startups and businesses, or is this more around de-risking investment, or is it a bit of both, or something else?
No, thank you. It's a great question. It's a bit of both. I mean, I think I think the definitions around adaptation and resilience and the breadth and depth of it, I think is challenging for a lot of folks to kind of wrap their heads around. Honestly, there's just so many factors to it, and I think some of the data around these areas and the quote unquote investability in the space has been admittedly very challenging. We have supported, and we look to provide, higher risk capital, catalytic capital, first loss capital, things of this nature to support, credit enhancements and guarantee structures and things of this nature to drive private capital into these types of markets. But depending on which area you're talking about, I think there are not that many commercial investors and private investors that are seeing that many opportunities to invest. So, it is, I think, highly fragmented and segmented and dependent on which area you're talking about. But I mean, just as by way of an example, we've supported the climate policy initiative for many years, and they have UNCDF is one example of one of the folks that are incubating ideas through there, and are developing a large multi-billion-dollar climate insurance linked resilient infrastructure finance facility. And they're talking about many years in order to get this to a place where it would be fundable from the private sector. And of course, there's a role for philanthropy to support these types of these early kind of incubation activities. But proving out the opportunity, I think, to the private markets through philanthropy is both a challenge and an opportunity. So one that we and many others are focused on, the early stage investment, the seed funding, and supporting through grants and other forms of capital ways to drive private capital towards these markets. But it is quite challenging. And yeah, I think we've found that the food and the ag space is one area where we see near-term opportunity to engage corporates and commercial investors, because the resilience and adaptation, I think, features of the supply chain are very obvious for those folks who have, who own assets and need to invest in the resilience and sustainability of their supply chains. I think for other areas, it's much more harder for them to understand how their investment dollars are, frankly, returning capital and achieving some of the impact areas that we all hope to support. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And it's certainly a shift that we've seen, within GRP in the last few years, is the level of interest from the private sector. I think they're still figuring this out, but we're seeing shift from major companies coming into this space more actively and substantively, but then also a lot of entrepreneurs as well, and including right through from venture capitalists up through. So I think it's moving in the right direction, perhaps not fast enough though, and I think philanthropy has a real role to play. I'm cognizant that we're approaching time, but I would love to get. I'm just seeing a question coming in. Looking at the predominant financing mechanisms of resilience measurement in cities. So maybe, Emma, that would be for you, especially around nature-based solutions. And maybe just if you could hopefully wrap that up in about a minute and just also provide any closing thoughts. And then I'll pass over to Johan and Alex just for about 30 seconds of final reflections. Thank you.
So Nate, I can't see the questions and I didn't hear it. Can you repeat it quickly?
Yeah, sure. So what are the dominating financing mechanisms of resilience measures in cities? So thinking like nature-based solutions. So dominated, I guess, financing mechanisms of resilience in cities.
I think this is still a massively emerging field. I think the ones that I am aware of and have been involved with in the UK are still incredibly experimental, and in many respects what we need to do, what we've done with our mitigation investments, is get down to sort of almost issue by issue what is the right financial mechanism that will unlock some of these steps that need to be taken, including involving nature-based solutions. I think some of the nature-based solutions work is greater, is further in advance. But one of the things we need to see more happening is decision-making being brought down to the cities. Very often, cities themselves don't have the powers to either set the enabling environment or indeed raise the money that is required. So I think that is a comment across many different countries, unlocking that ability, but also making sure that we're building the pipeline and bringing in different types of funding too. So shifting the grants that governments will often make in adaptation and nature-based solutions into guarantees, which will help bring in the private sector. There's far more I could say, but I know we're almost out of time.
Thank you so much, Emma. Johan, if I could just pass it over to you for a few words of closing, and Alex, I'll offer you the same, and then I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think this is, I think we should recognize that the topic of today, to combine resilience thinking, risk minimization in a turbulent world with finance, and what are the financial mechanisms to really change the course of development, is quite nascent, but urgently needed. So I think I think we shouldn't be too surprised that we don't have the big solutions just to take off the shelf, but we now need to put much more effort into providing thinking around what can be those levers that we can pull rapidly, combining finance and resilience. And I think the insurance industry, which has been emphasized several times here, is one really important entry point here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Johan. Alex, a few words?
I would just really reiterate Johan's points. I mean, I think we appreciate and lean on the scientific community for support on how to measure these things and the data, and that's important for financing as well. And also, I mean, the insurance and the pricing signals from other aspects of the market are critical. So it's a lot that needs to be pulled together rather quickly, but hopefully we can all lean on each other.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alex. And yeah, I think that point on leaning on each other, that's exactly what we try to do within the Global Resilience Partnership, is bring together the partners necessary to accelerate this transition and make this heavy task a bit lighter. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to the panelists. I know it's a very busy time of year, and we're at the build up to COP28, which is less than a month away now, which is a scary thing to say. And I'm sure we'll see many of you there, and the Resilience Hub will be a key focal point for more discussions on this, including a great paper we've got launching with BCG and USAID on building the investment case for building resilience in emerging market and developing economies, which will be launched at the US Center on the 6th of December in the afternoon, date to be determined, and then a further deep dive on the 8th of December at the Resilience Hub. And that'll be a real landmark report that I think will help to unpack some of this. And the registration is also open, as Ida has put into the chat. I'll also just mention that I know we didn't miss a lot of questions that have come in, but we'll be downloading those and providing answers to those offline for you all. So please do look for our email on those. But thank you again, everyone. I think this is, as was clearly articulated by all the panelists, is a key area that we need to pull these strands together and really push forward as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of different perspectives here, but I think we don't have a choice. It's an imperative, and appreciate all your work and look forward to pushing this forward with each and every one of you. Thanks again.